failures of the approach of lobbying, asking government more nicely and more urgently to do things differently next time, or even right now, just doesn't work.
Business in South Africa often goes along with the government to get along with the government. But is this the right strategy? I posed this question to Piet Roux and Russell Lamberti in a recent episode of my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. What follows is a short extract from our longer conversation. If you would like to watch the full discussion with Piet and Russell, you can do so by clicking on the link in the description below. Enjoy. Why do you think this kind of traditional understanding of business advocacy has failed? And what could be an alternative to it?
Well, David, I can take it even a little bit further back. If we look at the history of the past few hundred years, the state as we know it and its development, there was one of the things that stand out from statecraft is the idea that the state is responsible for maintaining a healthy economic environment, a healthy environment for business. And often we would hear the people legitimize the interventions of state laws and so on by saying, well, that's the legitimate role of government. So even in a minimal view of government, people still say that's the role of the state to create a good environment for business. But at Sakeliga, we say maybe that's not entirely correct. Maybe the responsibility should in the first instance lie with business itself. And certainly in South Africa, we've come to a point where abdicating the responsibility for a favorable environment for business to the state is imprudent. It is even, I would say, irresponsible. And we have come to a point where the obvious failures of the approach of lobbying, asking government more nicely and more urgently to do things differently next time, or even right now, just doesn't work. It's not enough to simply ask government. It's not enough to simply present better policies for government to adopt. We need to come to a point where we, instead of lobby for change, negotiate for change. And that's an important mind shift. And at Sakeliga, we certainly say that's what businesses should do. They should internalize the responsibility for creating a favorable environment and see the state as one of the important entities that should be engaged on this, but not ask the state to take that responsibility more seriously. Just say, become more strong as businesses, organize, and come to a point where we can negotiate with the state to say, this is not acceptable, we're not going to do B in this way, etc. And I think that's the point where we are now. We've seen a failure of asking the government more nicely. We need to come to a point of insisting more firmly.
Now, Russell, Neil Froneman, the CEO of Sibanye-Stillwater, the mining company, has said that we need to abandon the consensus-seeking approach and move more towards a transactional approach, similar to what Peter's just said. Why do you think business is so inclined towards this kind of social partnership kind of model? Why have they gone along with this? And how do we begin to kind of nudge business towards this more transactional approach?
This is a great line of questioning, and I'm quite encouraged that people are coming to this realization from different perspectives and from different angles. It's not like we're all getting into a room and coming up with this idea. So that excites me because it shows that there's sort of a bit of a dawning of perception on this thing. It's intuitively appealing that to create social order, you must agree on everything. Okay. The problem is that humans and groups and various different interest groups and so on have such divergent views of the world. This is what a plurality and pluralism is all about. We have very different views of the world, different ideas on how to get where we're going. So, some of us have different destinations. To the extent that we have the same destinations, different means and methods of getting there. And I think when you try and build consensus and create, social compacts and so on, you end up focusing only on what you can agree on. And very often that's actually very little. So you often only make progress or cooperation on quite trivial matters, and you leave unspoken about the things that you really disagree on, which very often is very substantive. And that ends up festering in the background and doesn't actually get dealt with, and creates tremendous amount of grievance. And I think we've got to move now towards a much more mature method of engagement, which is the idea of making demands, reciprocity, so hearing the other side's demands, figuring out how to react to those demands, and essentially negotiating a particular position. What you've called a more perhaps transactional approach. Far more mature, far more realistic in a society of divergent interests. So it's really encouraging that seems to be where some thinking is heading now. And we certainly are beginning to see quite clearly that understands the creation of social order in a far deeper and more mature way than pretending that we agree on everything.
So, Piet, if you look around you, you see the state retreating from some of its core functions, and you may have seen reports of Discovery Insure sponsoring fire trucks in the city of Johannesburg. We now have a private fire force. When I go on my morning runs through the suburbs of Joburg, I see potholes that have been freshly filled in. Discovery's lettering is stenciled on the top because they're taking this initiative. They're literally filling little voids left by the retreating state. But on the other hand, when I go to Woolworths on a Saturday morning, I'm told that I must wear my mask, even though the pandemic is now endemic. And in many ways, the lockdown showed that businesses have actually been quite equivocal in terms of their relationship with the state. They've been quite keen to enforce some of these rather arbitrary edicts, or they've just kind of capitulated. So what has the lockdown taught us about the appropriate role for the corporate sector? Sakeliga has been very involved in business for ending lockdown and has been challenging a number of the lockdown regulations. What are the lessons learned 2 and a bit years later from this lockdown experience, and how can businesses maybe respond a bit differently to state overreach in future?
There's a paradox. The paradox is that as South Africa, as the country continues down the path of state failure, it's not a failed state, but it's on the path of state failure, and it'll continue on this path. There's nothing to suggest that it will stay that course, or deviate from that course. So South Africa is on a path of state failure. Now the paradox is that as things start to fall apart more and more, as there are millions of people unemployed, there are state hospitals don't work. There are potholes everywhere. Fire trucks, they're not coming around. And then we have much more private security officers, etc., than police officers. All of that, the listeners, the viewers know about many more examples. The state, as the state failure progresses, it seems like the state seizes onto non-issues and try and exert its power there. And maybe what we've seen now with regard to the treatment of COVID and lockdowns is a harbinger of what we can expect to come. The non-real crises will be pretended to be the core crises, and we will see the state's attention focus away from the things that really need solving, because the state is unable to solve them, to try and manage what is today a non-issue, which is COVID-19. And so that's an interesting paradox. I think we will see more of it. We did see companies go along with the state's approach, and we did see many companies deviate from that. I think in general, smaller and medium-sized companies did not go along with the state, and they intuitively knew what was going on. This is harmful. You can't just close business. If you don't make stuff, there won't be any stuff. We did see among corporates disheartening support during some phases of lockdown for government's actions, and I think that's unwise. And I think if we reflect back on that, hopefully we will see some corporates be less inclined to do so in future. But the real importance, and Discoveries may be a good example. It was very supportive of lockdown often, but it also fills the potholes and provides private fire trucks. But again, on the other hand, I just read today that it's also in favor of some form of national health insurance and wants to manage that, perhaps assist the government. So I think there's especially going to the large corporates, you will see a certain tensions. And I think it would be wonderful if companies in South Africa in general tend to be more independent, And we will certainly see more and more independence from medium-sized and small businesses. Corporates are exposed on many levels to state capture.
Thanks for watching. Let's hand over to you, our audience. Do you think that businesses should become more independent of the state? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. Also, if you would like to watch the full interview with Piet and Russell, you can do so by clicking here, and you can also subscribe to my other channel that's linked over here. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.